Welcome back to another episode of the Recharge Zone podcast. I'm your host, Ann-Margaret, and I'm joined by my co-host, Brent. As we mentioned on our last episode with Paul Bertetti, this year is International Year of Caves in Karst. The cave beetle has been designated as Animal of the Year. So today we're going to talk about the two endangered species of beetle with two members of the Edwards Aquifer Habitat Conservation Plan Department at the Edwards Aquifer Authority, Kristy and Kristina.
Okay, so last season, Kristy, who is an environmental scientist, discussed some of the other threatened and endangered species that are part of the EAHCP and a few other species that can be found in the Edwards Aquifer system. So welcome back, Kristy.
Thanks, Brent. It's great to be back.
And we also have Kristina here today in her debut feature on the podcast. Kristina is a Habitat Conservation Coordinator with the EAHCP. Welcome, Kristina. Would you mind sharing a little bit about your role at the EAHCP department?
Yes, thank you for having me. My work is less scientific and more administrative. I help with work plans and budgets, reports, and committee meetings associated with the EAHCP. And due to my background in GIS, I also help analyze and assess some of the spatial data our contractors collect. I have lived in San Marcos for almost 17 years, so I specialize in the aspects of the EAHCP that occur in and involve the City of San Marcos and Texas State University, who are two of the 5 EAHCP permittees.
It's so great to have both of you. I'm super excited to talk to you both about our subject today.
So Kristy, for those tuning in, like Brent mentioned, we had you on last season, but can you share with our listeners what it looks like to be an environmental scientist in the EAHCP department?
Sure, Ann-Margaret. Well, being an environmental scientist, I get to get hands-on with our species that are covered by the EAHCP. And what that means is I get to go out with the contractors that biologically monitor the species. So they go out and assess their distribution and their abundance twice a year. And then I also get to be involved in our Refugia program, which is set in place to have the species at an offsite facility. And they also do quite a bit of research on these species so that we better understand them.
Thank you for giving that brief intro. So like we mentioned earlier, we're here to talk about some of the beetle species that are part of the EAHCP. So can you describe some of the characteristics of the Comal Springs dryopid beetle, I think I'm saying that correctly, and its habitat?
Absolutely, Ann-Margaret. The Comal Springs dryopid beetle is the only dryopidae species to be found within the subterranean habitat. And what is subterranean? That means that we find it within the aquifer and also find it above it, but primarily it's known to be down in the subterranean habitat. And given that it has been adapted to being within the subterranean aquifer where there's not much light, it has began to have non-functional eyes or vestigial eyes, so it no longer uses its eyes. And it also lacks pigment and no longer is winged, so it's a wingless adult. The dryopid beetle, if you saw it in the wild, you probably just think it was a speck of dirt because it's so small. It's approximately 3 millimeters in total length at its maximum size. And so it's very small as far as when we look at other beetles. Another cool aspect of the dryopid beetle is that it's a lungless adult. So how does it breathe water underwater? Well, it uses these hydrophobic hairs to collect the air pocket, and it uses that to breathe underwater.
So, Kristina, I know that one way that we're able to share all these interesting facts and characteristics about these species is through this platform called Story Maps. Would you mind telling us what Story Maps are and what they can do to offer people wanting to learn more?
Sure. Story Maps is an interactive application created by Esri or ArcGIS. Enables us to share pictures, videos, maps, reports, and spatial data in an easy to view format. The EAHCP covered species story maps helps us explain how the Edwards Aquifer Habitat Conservation Plan protects and enhances habitat for the threatened endangered species. We have a lot of information on our website that includes the HCP as well as annual reports and biological monitoring reports, work plans, research, etc. But it can be hard to piece it all together and understand how it all works. Each story map has a comprehensive overview of the species and refugia operations. The refugia program is overseen by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who collect, research, and propagate the endangered species to help ensure that we have a backup population in case there is a disaster or a catastrophic event, such as extreme drought. Each species has a refugia story map that focuses more on the scientific aspects of the collection methodology and the research being done by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the San Marcos and Uvalde facilities. Not many people know or understand the scope of the EAHCP, and we hope to rectify that by sharing what we do and what we have learned about the species over the years through an easy to understand format.
That's perfect. And for our listeners who want to take a look at the story maps and perhaps learn more, we'll post a link in the podcast description.
So kind of in theme with explaining these different species that are covered species of the EAHCP, Kristy, can you let us know, like, what is it required for the Comal Springs dryopid beetle to thrive? And can you explain a little bit about in-depth details? I know you say it's a small little tiny beetle, but do we know that information?
Well, Ann-Margaret, prior to the EAHCP, there wasn't much known about the dryopid beetle, but with the start and the initiation of the EAHCP, through our research program, through our applied research as well as the refugia, we've been able to expand our knowledge on this species. However, there's still a lot of information we still need to learn about it to effectively be able to protect the species into the future. But what we do know now is through some of our applied research is that they do tend to move with flow. So it seems that spring flow is important for this species. And also there was a life cycle study completed and is currently being completed through our refugia program. And it looks like that the dryopid beetle, it spends its entire life cycle within the aquatic environment. However, our contractors, or through the research, has shown that they do need some sort of interaction to the terrestrial habitat to complete their full life cycle. So in order for this species to thrive, it's suggested that they need this interaction between the springs or the spring water coming from the aquifer and have that connection with the terrestrial habitat so that it can complete its full life cycle.
And what is the full life cycle? And I guess what is a part of their diet? Like, what do they eat to survive?
So a full life cycle for the dryopid beetles, it starts out as an egg, it hatches, and then it goes into a larvae stage. And it actually goes through what they call several instars in a larvae. So that's simply where it grows larger and larger and larger. And it's thought that the dryopid beetle lives for approximately 1 year as a larvae until it pupates, and then it actually goes into its adult stage, where it's also found to live approximately 1 year. Now, what does it eat? Well, from what we've uncovered so far with our research, it looks like they feed off of biofilm that they find on submerged wood. So a lot of times when the researchers go out, they have found the most common place to collect these dryopid beetles is on submerged wood or roots. And they thought that it is the thought that they use this as a material to collect or scrape the biofilm off of it. And that's what they eat.
Oh, wow. So when you all collect them, do you collect them as individual specimens, or do you have to take whatever they're on and then use that?
Well, previously, it was really the dryopid beetle was collected through the collection of another beetle. But as we've learned through the EAHCP, the most effective way is to go out there, and what we do is handpick. So you go to an area where there's a lot of roots or wood, and a lot of times they have microscopes out in the field, and so they'll collect several different beetles. There's more than these two species out there, so a lot of times in the field they'll have to inspect them, look for the correct anatomy, and then they know that it's a dryopid beetle, and they can take those individual species.
Wow, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, because I'm like, if they're so tiny, it probably takes you all, like, it's methodical in the way that you all collect them.
Correct. And prior to the EAHCP, it was not known how to distinguish a male and a female dryopid beetle. However, through research through our Refugia program, we do now know how to effectively distinguish males and females, and that helps us in our research in the Refugia to propagate more individuals into the future.
So, Kristina, are these the kinds of features and information about the beetle that we'll find within the story maps?
Yes, the story maps offer a one-stop shop for all of that information that Kristy just mentioned. It talks about the species habitat, how they are collected, the type of research being done while in captivity. It also has a comprehensive overview of the EAHCP, and we also include some additional tips on how people living in Central Texas can help protect the dryopid beetle's habitat through water conservation, properly disposing of household hazardous waste, and other tips in the What You Can Do section.
Very cool. I got to check those out myself.
So now moving on to the other beetle species that's a part of the covered species of the EAHCP. Kristy, can you explain a little bit about this species and how it differs from the dryopid species?
Absolutely, Ann-Margaret. So a species that is found in the same location as the dryopid beetle is the Comouse Springs riffle beetle. So very similar names, one name different. And how does it differ from the dryopid beetle? Well, the dryopid is considered subterranean in the fact that it has vestigial eyes, and the riffle beetle still maintains its eyesight, so it's not considered a subterranean. I've never seen it considered a subterranean. However, we do find it subsurface, and it's believed that they do utilize the conduits of the aquifer to move around. And we actually know a little bit more about the Comouse Springs riffle beetle. They're a little bit easier to collect. We've been studying them for a little bit longer. And the Comouse Springs riffle beetle is unlike the dryopid, is that it still retains its eyesight. And it's a little bit shorter in length, so 2 millimeters, which is 3 millimeters. Now, that's a big size when you're thinking in millimeters and a tiny little beetle. And it's also somewhat more rounded in its body as opposed to elongated as the dryopid. So Ann-Margaret, beginning back in the early 2000s and through different sampling methodologies, researchers and scientists have found that the most effective way to collect the riffle beetle is through putting out cotton lures. And so they actually take a piece of white cloth, it's polyester cotton, and they submerge that within a spring orifice, where the springs are bubbling out of the aquifer, for approximately 1 month. And within that 1 month, the biofilms accumulate on the cotton, and then it's thought that as the riffle beetle is walking through its environment and it finds this cotton with the biofilm, which it feeds on, it stays in there, and then we're able to pull out that lure and collect the riffle beetle through that method. So that's a little, and as I briefly mentioned earlier, the dryopid beetle on occasion does get collected within these lures, but now we know that it's more effective to just collect them off of wood within the same type of area.
Wow. And how did y'all, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but how did you all discover that cotton were something that were useful?
Well, there's a funny story that they say that Randy Gibson, who works out at SMARC, the San Marcos Aquatic Research Center, didn't have anything, and he had his underwear and he pulled a piece off of it and put it down into the springs. I doubt that's exactly what happened, but the white cotton material is actually pretty effective given that the beetle is black. And so while you find the riffle beetle on wood and decaying or breaking down leaves, it's much easier for you to see the riffle beetle on this cotton material. And I think that's why we've moved to using the cotton lure to collect the beetle. It's less time consuming to sort through material where the riffle beetle blends in.
So it's like you all put it out there for the contrast of from the riffle beetle to the cotton, and then the riffle beetle in turn loves the fact that there's food on it. So it's like it's a win-win for all.
To me, it seems that the beetle is opportunistic. We recently done a study looking at giving the beetle an opportunity to reside within a lure that has cotton, leaves, or wood, and what the study suggests is that they're equally distributed. So to me, it suggests that they are just finding where the food is available and staying there and then moving on.
Makes perfect sense.
Kristina, is there a story map for the Comal Springs riffle beetle? And is this the kind of information available on that one as well?
Yes, Brent, there is a story map for the Comal Springs riffle beetle. It contains similar information to the dryopid beetle, such as where it's found, how it's sampled, and the research that's being done. However, since 2013, we have sponsored more research on the riffle beetle compared to the dryopid beetle. So the riffle beetle story map is more robust and has more information since we know more about the species. Researchers have been able to successfully propagate the riffle beetle in captivity, which means that we have a better understanding of their general life cycle and habitat needs. We hope to have similar information for the dryopid beetle as we study it more in the coming years.
So Kristina, really quickly, so for the riffle beetle, and on these story maps, is it dynamic information like video clips and like being able to scroll through it, or is it mostly just text and pictures?
Yes, Ann-Margaret, it's actually a combination of all of that. We showcase videos and pictures as well as embed reports. A lot of this information, like I mentioned earlier, is scattered all over our website. And so this just kind of provides a means for pulling it all together in one spot and making it easy for people to find these reports and to see a video of the species in captivity and sometimes in the wild.
And being a story map, you're able to actually see geographically or spatially where these species exist and where these studies are taking place, right?
Yes, that is correct. We don't have spatial data for all of the species within these story maps, but we do have it for certain species, such as the sampling sites and exactly where they're collected in the system.
Very cool.
So, Kristy, why is it important to protect not only these 2 beetle species, but the other 6 species that are a part of the EAHCP?
Sure, Ann-Margaret. By protecting these beetle species, the Comal Springs dryopid beetle and the riffle beetle, along with our other EAHCP covered species, by protecting these, we're able to preserve the species diversity and the uniqueness of our spring systems, the Comal and the San Marcos, given that if these species weren't here, we wouldn't find them anywhere else. But by protecting these EAHCP species, we're also protecting other species in the systems, given that they help maintain the springs and therefore the habitat of these systems. We consider these, our EAHCP species, umbrella species in this way. By also protecting our species, we're maintaining these systems, and that is a benefit for the human, given that we like to play and recreate within these spring systems. So that's another benefit and importance of maintaining and protecting these species.
Exactly, Kristy and Margaret. I get this question a lot from folks, including people from my own family. Why do we spend all this money and time protecting a blind salamander or a 2-millimeter beetle in the springs? And Kristy hit the nail on the head. If we are protecting these species and they're thriving, that means the aquifer is thriving too. It means we're doing something right. Now, on the other hand, if they're dying out, if we're letting the springs go dry, obviously we're mismanaging the system and creating something that's unsustainable. So in that respect, it's incredibly important to protect them, not only because of how fascinating and interesting they are, but because they're an indicator of the health of the aquifer.
Well said, Brent.
And I really like that that take on it, Brent, too, because like Kristina was mentioning throughout our episode, the story maps provide that kind of one-stop shop information on the species for the public to understand, where these species live, the importance of them, their habitat, and further the awareness for the Edwards Aquifer Habitat Conservation Plan, which in turn furthers the awareness for the Edwards Aquifer system as a whole. So, Kristina, where can people find these story maps to learn more?
There are two ways to view the story maps on our website. You can find it through the covered species page, and each species has their own story map link within that page. And then there's also a way of viewing it through our GIS data on our homepage. I just wanted to note, though, that we only currently have 5 species story maps, including the Comal Springs riffle beetle, the Comal Springs dryopid beetle, the fountain darter, the Texas blind salamander, and the San Marcos salamander. We hope to produce the story maps for the remaining species, the Texas wild rice, Pex cave amphipod, the Texas troglodytic water slater, and the Comal Springs salamander by this time next year.
Great. Thank you so much, Kristy and Kristina, for being on this episode. Like we mentioned earlier, it's International Year of Caves and Karst, and the animal of the year are the cave beetles. So, Kristy, just before we go, one of these is actually an aquatic cave beetle and one is not, right?
That's correct, Ann-Margaret. We consider the dryopid beetle a subterranean species, and the riffle beetle is not necessarily considered a subterranean. However, we do believe that it does utilize that subterranean habitat. We're just not sure to the extent.
So thank you, Kristy, for explaining the importance of protecting these covered species of the EAHCP.
And I want to thank you for joining us, and hopefully we can have you all again, maybe when those maps are done and we can talk about other species in the future. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Brent. Glad to be back.
Thank y'all.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Recharge Zone podcast. Have questions, ideas for topics, or things you would like to share with us? Well, reach out to us at rechargezone@edwardsaquifer.org.